Have you ever heard this sound in your favorite medical TV drama or when you're visiting someone at the hospital and wondered what it actually is? That beeping sound is from an electrocardiogram machine, or in simpler terms, an ECG. An ECG is a test that measures the electrical activity of the heart to ensure that it is working properly. Electrodes are placed on the surface of the skin and the heart's activity is recorded. So what do these waves actually represent? In order to understand this, we need to understand the heart's anatomy and how blood flows through it. The heart is a muscular organ which pumps blood to the rest of the body. It is composed of muscle cells, nerve cells, and pacemaker cells. The heart is divided into 4 chambers, with a ventricle and atrium on both the left and right sides. There are 2 major types of valves. Ones that separate the atria from the ventricles, known as atrioventricular valves, and others that separate the ventricles from blood vessels. The atrioventricular valves are composed of leaflets, which are flap-like structures, as well as chordae tendineae, which are elastic band-like structures that connect the leaflets to the papillary muscles. Valves open and close based on a pressure system to permit or restrict blood flow, depending on whether the heart is in a contracted or relaxed state. The aorta is the largest artery in the body and is nestled directly on top of the heart. It supplies blood to the brain and then travels deep to supply the rest of the body. The goal of the heart is to move blood in a forwards direction in order to supply nutrients and oxygen to the rest of the body. How does blood enter the heart? Let's find out. Deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium via veins. It then passes through the tricuspid valve, a type of atrioventricular valve, and enters into the right ventricle. After this, blood passes through the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary artery, and to the lungs in order to become oxygenated. This oxygenated blood re-enters the heart through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. Blood passes through the mitral valve, another atrioventricular valve, into the left ventricle. Lastly, blood flows through the aortic valve and is sent out to the rest of the body. Now that's a lot of information to take in. Let's listen to a song to remember.
Deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, passes through the tricuspid valve, enters the right ventricle, up through the pulmonary artery. Oxygenated blood enters the left atrium, passes through the mitral valve, enters the left ventricle, up through the aorta.
Now that we understand the heart's anatomy and how blood flows through the heart, let's take a closer look at the actual ECG and understand what each portion represents. We already know that the ECG as a whole represents the electrical current moving through the heart. The movement of the current is divided into several sections, and each part is given an alphabetical designation. Each heartbeat begins with an impulse from the heart's pacemaker cells. As the electrical activity forms, the atria are in a relaxed state and they fill with blood. Once the electrical signal is fully developed, the right and left atria contract simultaneously. This contraction pushes the blood into the ventricles, and this action produces the first deflection on the ECG trace. It is known as the P wave and is no more than 120 milliseconds in duration. Once the atria have contracted and the ventricles are filled with blood, the electrical current flows to the ventricles and activates them, causing them to contract. This action produces a QRS complex. A normal QRS interval is around 120 milliseconds in duration. The QRS wave is composed of 3 individual segments. The first downward deflection is known as the Q wave, which is followed by a large upward deflection known as the R wave. The S wave is a large downward deflection that is the last constituent of the QRS complex. Once the ventricles have contracted and the blood is pumped to the body, they relax in order to fill with blood for the next incoming heartbeat. This allows the ventricles to recover from contraction and is represented by the T wave. Let's learn another song to easily remember the components of an ECG trace.
When the atrium pumps, you get the P wave. When the ventricle pumps, you get the QRS wave. When the heart relaxes, you get the T wave. Now you know how to read an ECG.
For a more advanced understanding of the ECG trace, you have to understand that the time between the waves is important to ensure the heart is working properly. There is a PR interval, which begins at the start of the P wave and ends at the beginning of the QRS complex. The normal duration for a PR interval is 120 to 200 milliseconds. The QT interval starts at the beginning of the QRS complex and ends at the end of the T wave and is usually less than or between 440 to 460 milliseconds. Deviations from these normal intervals may indicate a problem with the heart. Now that you understand how ECGs work, next time Grey's Anatomy comes on, you'll have a better understanding of what's really going on.